Danach kommt Sabbatai Sevi und die Frankisten. Code 666. Und dann machen wir kognitive Kriegsführung. Haben wir was zu tun. Ich gehe erstmal aufs Klo. Ihr hört erstmal zu. Geht's denn? Na? Restart. Echt jetzt? Na gut, dann müssen wir halt nochmal bis ganz runterspulen. Ihr solltet alle diese Sendung kennen, jeden einzelnen Talk. Ich kenne sie alle, deswegen habe ich immer recht, auch wenn das blöd klingt. Jeder einzelne Talk ist ein Buch, das vorgestellt wird. Es sind ca. 1000 Bücher, die ihr nicht kennt. Ich kenne sie alles, das ist der kleine, aber feine Unterschied. So, jetzt scrollen wir uns hier erstmal einen ab. Selbst Daniele Ganser hat es geschafft, hierher zu kommen. Auf diese Seite, ne? Hier haben wir es. Aleister Crowley, Agent 666.
If you want to think about Quinn, and this is what made more sense. And really, why should they do that? See, that's the next question. Why would the Germans trust him? Why would they ever take anything that he said seriously, even if he agreed to write propaganda for them? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons for that. And the most important one is a connection that Crowley made just before the war broke out. And that connection was with another guy, which episode is mentioned in the book. And it's another one of those things I've learned more details about since. But the fellow is a German occultist and journalist by the name of Theodor Reuss, R-E-U-S-S. So Theodor Reuss was the guy, if anybody's ever heard of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, an organization that Crowley sort of later became the head of, which still exists today. But the guy who actually founded that, or one of the people who founded it, was Theodor Reuss. It was a German organization. It was a German secret society that sort of originally aspired that it was going to be a kind of universal secret society that would include all the other Freemasonry, Rosicrucians. They'd all be brought under the umbrella of the OTO. So in 1912, in Berlin, Crowley was initiated into the OTO by Theodor Reuss. So I said that Reuss was a journalist. He was a journalist who worked mostly in London, but that in fact was his cover, because guess what else Theodor Reuss was besides being an occultist and a journalist? He was a British intelligence agent. Not British, not British. He was a German intelligence agent. And his
Ein deutscher Agent, der gleichzeitig britischer Agent ist, aber gleichzeitig auch Okkultist und Journalist. Faszinierend.
Job was, or part of this was to create the OTO, I think for his own private reasons. I mean, I think that he had his own kind of, let's say, spiritual reasons to do that. But the other thing it did is that it served admirably as a potential tool for German intelligence. So remember what he was creating. He was creating a kind of overarching occult society, the OTO, which would bring in existing organizations, not all of Freemasonry, branches of it, a whole variety of Rosicrucian and synarchist societies, Gnostic churches, you name it, they take anybody. So it would have widespread connections. And the other point is that it was to become an international body. It was to spread to all the countries of the world. So what have you got? A secret organization secretly under the control or connected to German intelligence, which functions as a secret society in the English-speaking world in South America and Australia, everywhere. Okay? One of the things, again, it becomes an ideal cover for intelligence activities. So in 1912, Royce initiates Crowley into this and essentially names Crowley, you know, you're going to be the head of the organization in all the English-speaking countries, you know, which would include America. So when Crowley went to America again in October 1914, he also went as something else. He went as a representative of the British government on both the, you know, cover and real level. And then he also went as a representative of Royce and the OTO, which meant he simultaneously went as a representative of German intelligence. So the simple reason as to why the German diplomats and propagandists in New York accepted him is because people in Berlin told them to.
Und warum sagten ihm Leute in Berlin, dass Aleister Crowley vertrauenswürdig ist? Weil Aleister Crowley auf Deutsch machte, das Vaterland schrieb und sich mit den Iren verbündet hat, damit Churchill einen Grund hat.
And the main person in Berlin who did that was Theodore Royce, who, what did he do during the war? He worked full-time for German intelligence. So Royce, the guy who initiated Crowley into the OTO during the same war, becomes a high figure in German intelligence in Berlin, and he's the guy who gives the bona fides to Crowley. That's why they trust him. And one of the things, Ian, you can find in the book is that Crowley is in contact with Royce all through the war. Royce is busy doing things like trying to organize Masonic conferences in Switzerland, which are also being manipulated by the Germans in order to try to advance early peace proposal.
So, also in der Schweiz, wo ja auch die Zionisten ihre Kongresse abhielten, hat die OTO also.
So, you know, it's one of those things that shows again that this connection between occultism and intelligence isn't some peculiar British thing. The Germans did it as well. And to me, it explains why Crowley was able to pick up the pieces of his mission in New York, why he was able to successfully insinuate himself into the confidence of the Germans in America. Now, if he wasn't chasing Roger Casement anymore, who, you know, Roger Casement, where did he go? Just to finish off that story, well, he escaped New York and he actually successfully got to Berlin to plead his case in front of the German general staff. And they didn't give him much aid. They really wouldn't promise him very much, just one shipload of arms. But they put him on a U-boat, and then in early 1916, they dropped him off of the coast of Western Ireland, and this was just before something called the Easter Rebellion took place. So later on, that's reasonably well known to some people. You know, one of the big events in modern Irish history is the Easter Rising, and that Easter Rising is the rebellion that Casement started negotiating with Germans in New York. What happened to Casement, though, is he was captured by a constable, taken back to London, put on trial for high treason, sentenced to death, and hanged. So that's what happened to real traitors. Roger Casement died at the end of a rope. And by the way, one of the things that the British government used to make sure that he was hanged, because remember, he was someone who had, you know, as you might have expected, there would be people who would argue that because of his past service to the crown, because of all the good and wonderful things that he'd done, that certainly he should be spared the death penalty. Well, that's when Scotland Yard came up with the Black Diaries. And the Black Diaries, yes. The Black Diaries were, you know, essentially his sort of recounting of his sexual escapades with men and boys all around the world in graphic detail. And once that came out, and this was 1916, all of Casement's friends and supporters pretty much ran for cover, and they hanged him.
It was like his Twitter account had been.
Yes, okay, they got all of his Twitter account. Okay?
But in the book, you suggest perhaps that might have been planted? Like, that's too obvious a piece of evidence?
Well, there's an ongoing debate today. I mean, part of it is that there are people who just absolutely do not want to believe that their hero, Roger Casement, was ever gay, right? That's part. And actually, you know, I think that may, in some degree, if you leave the Black Diaries out of it, in other words, if you argue that those are a forgery, it's possibly debatable. on the other hand, it seems to have been one of the things that other people who knew Casement well sort of recognized. I mean, remember, this was, Edwardian hypocrisy at its finest. Everybody knew what his predilections were, but so long as they were private, no one was ever going to talk about them.
Is there any evidence that Crowley supplied that diary?
It's one of those things that it's sort of, I can't see how he would be in the place and time to do it. On the other hand, it's not impossible that he picked up information in New York. I'm sure that if he came across anything in New York that might have assisted in the compiling them, if that was necessary, then he would have supplied it. That was part of his job. But it's not something that he could have done on his own. I don't think we could lay that at his feet. Now, the interesting thing is that what Crowley later told people, and he said this on more than one occasion, is that what his real mission in America became, what it was really about wasn't catching Roger Casement or getting any dirt on him or war supplies. It was the big mission, the big sort of secret goal of British intelligence, which was to bring the United States into the war.
Also, um einen zionistischen Plan umzusetzen, brauchte man Aleister Crowley, der Amerika in den Krieg brachte. Im zweiten zionistischen Step brauchte man Adolf Hitler. Aleister Crowley hat 100.000 Millionen Leichen auf seinem Konto und er erfand die New Age.
Now, the interesting thing about it is that really was the ultimate secret goal of British intelligence in the United States, to bring the U.S. into the war. And one of the reasons I can say that is because someone else that I've done a fair amount of research on is the guy who was the formal head of what we would call MI6 in New York, who was a fellow by the name of Sir William Wiseman.
Yeah, he's
I got to write a book about him.
Yeah, he's a very not unreported figure, but an important figure in the in the 20th century. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he later becomes a big deal on Wall Street. He later becomes a Hollywood producer.
That's linking the occult intelligence to
and Hollywood, and to the entertainment industry. If you ever wonder who was sort of one of those people pushing for pro-British films in the 1930s, things like Gunga Din. Mm-hmm. Okay, I don't. Have you ever seen Gunga Din, the old film with has Wallace Beery and Cary Grant? All right. So the whole plot of that, of course, is that it extols the British Raj. All of the Englishmen in it are quirky but pillars of decency. Mm-hmm. And of course, who are they up against? Horrible devil worshipping, snake cultist Indian nationalists. All right.
This is at a critical moment too in British.
Right, and this is a period.
Also, wer kennt sie nicht? Die Buddhisten, die Hinduisten, die mit ihrem Schlangengift radikale Terroristen sind. Jeder kennt doch den Inder. Der Inder ist dafür bekannt, Moslem zu sein, Terrorist. Als sich Indien von der britischen Krone befreien wollte, haben sie Filme gemacht, die davon erzählen, dass der Hindu ein Massenmörder ist. Das kann doch pretty good.
Yeah, when India was still a part of the British Raj, but Indian nationalism, and what those films are, as entertaining as they may be, if if anybody out there sees Gunga Din or Lives of a Bengal Lancer, any of those films that came out of that period, they are propaganda pieces for British imperialism.
Yeah, this is the Quarter Circle, and I saw one that the kids were watching, a Shirley Temple movie. I think it was called The Little Princess. And it's just one big Queen Victoria is great, and it's one big pro-British Empire movie. Yeah, it's fun.
And then all the loyal Indians are wonderful and happy, and all of the nationalists are evil people. So, and the thing is that it's one of those things that's not just screenwriters. Okay, that's people at the production level. What Wiseman was connected with was a thing called Lasky's Famous Players, and behind that he was also a partner in one of the big investment banks, Kuhn Loeb and Company. And they have the money, and people who have money in Hollywood, no surprise, tend to have an influence, and that was part of his job. And when World War II rolls along, by the way, Wiseman goes right back into the service for British intelligence. Mm-hmm. So Wiseman said exactly the same thing that Crowley said, that Wiseman knew that his job, when he shows up in the U.S. about 2 years later after Crowley, about in the fall of 1916. Actually, early in the part of 1916, when Wiseman shows up, he later says that, yes, my job, my ultimate job, my job was to keep track of, Indian seditionists and Irish revolutionaries and German propagandists. I was supposed to do all of that stuff. But my real job was to bring America into the war. So it's interesting that the guy who is essentially the head of MI6 and Crowley are claiming that they were working to a common goal. That was the goal of British intelligence, because getting the U.S. into the war was the only way to guarantee that America's monetary and industrial support remained behind the Allied cause. So there's an untold story in terms of how that happened. And the interesting thing is that both Crowley and Wiseman believed that they had been successful. Now, in Wiseman's case, he believed he'd been successful because he became close friends to President Woodrow Wilson's confidential advisor, Colonel Edward House. And Colonel Edward House got William Wiseman basically free access to the White House. I mean, I want you to try to imagine that working today, in which a presidential advisor was discovered to have introduced the head of a foreign intelligence agency, not only to the president, but to have facilitated their meetings. And to give you another idea as how it worked, Wiseman could go and have a meeting with the president without having a prior appointment. The Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, needed an appointment.
Also, der britische Geheimdienstagent, Verbindungsoffizier, konnte jederzeit ins Weiße Haus rein, während der Secretary of the State sich anmelden musste.
So here is a foreign spy who has greater access to the White House than the Secretary of State. So, Wiseman felt that he had gotten the ear of the most important person in the country. So I guess I would now qualify under meddling. Now, Crowley wasn't anywhere near that level, but he also tended to think that he played a role in this. And one of the ways that he thought he played a role, or he claimed he played a role, is by encouraging the Germans to sink the very ship that he'd come to America on, Lusitania. So in early May 1915, in a story that most people have heard of at some point, the Lusitania was torpedoed by the U-20 off the south coast of Ireland. It went down very quickly, a lot faster than anybody expected. More than 1,000 people died, including more than 100 Americans. And that set off a diplomatic crisis between the neutral United States and Germany. And it did not. I'll still run across this every now and then. And, I have students who...
Zu diesem Zeitpunkt war Amerika noch deutschlandfreundlich. Erst Anschläge in Amerika gegen Amerikaner von Deutschen, die eingespritten waren, plus die Lusitania führten dazu, dass Amerika nicht auf Deutschlands Seite in den Krieg ging.
I'll write this in a paper and then I have to flunk them on it. But the whole thing is they'll say that when the Germans sank the Lusitania and that brought America into the war. No, that didn't happen. It was 2 years later. But what it did do was it started the process. It gave the Germans a tremendous PR black eye that they could never recover from. They could never dig themselves out of that hole. So how did Crowley argue that he contributed to that? Well, remember, he started writing propaganda. And his friend Viereck, who was the editor of the Fatherland, introduced Crowley, and he did, to a thing called the Propaganda Cabinet. And the Propaganda Cabinet was a private meeting, a kind of secret society of German, some of them were newspaper editors, some of them were consuls, diplomatic figures. Again, one of them was the military attaché, Franz von Papen. And they met in New York, and their job, okay, the British want to bring America into the war, right? So what do the Germans want to do?
Keep America out.
Keep them out. Okay, they want to discourage the Yankees from help. They don't want the Americans coming in because they know they'll come in on the Allied side.
Just remind them who were in the White House.
Yeah, okay, well, they did,
yeah, that's a century ago, right?
Yeah, in the British propaganda was always going, well, things happened in the past, but it was, they try to pretend that the Revolutionary War never really happened.
Always forgive them. Never mind.
Yes, blood is thicker than water, and we speak the same language.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I like how they call it the propaganda cabinet. Now, if they were British, they would have called it like the Committee for Public Information or something.
Or the Daffodil Club.
Yeah.
Okay. The whole point was never to have a name that you would have. So keep in mind, these are German publicists, academics, and officials in the neutral United States, and they're meeting because the whole goal of German propaganda, what it is they're talking about, was to keep the Americans out. So the question is, what's the best way to do that? I don't know. Do we try to inform Americans about the burning of the White House? Maybe that's what we should do. Do we try to dredge up the Revolutionary War, or do we just try to explain to them, Germany's cause? That was actually one of the things they tried early on, is that, Germany's really being picked on, but we're surrounded and we're being beset by the French and the Russians and the British and everybody, and we haven't done anything to them. And this is where Crowley said he came in. Crowley, remember, can claim to be, what is he? He's a master of metaphysics. And on the basis of that, he could claim that he knew a great deal about the subtleties of the mass psychology of Anglo-Saxons, right? And, at that point in time, Anglo-Saxons were, practically speaking, the ruling class of the United States. And therefore, that was what you wanted. So he goes, the way he influenced them. So he said, look, my experience with the Americans has taught me this. Americans are childlike people. They're not inherently militaristic. They're childlike in the sense that they respond to firmness and they respond to fear. And therefore, rather than trying to lecture them about things that they really don't have the intellectual capacity to understand, you just basically need to scare the bejesus out of them. And the way to do that is to show them that Germany is powerful and shouldn't be messed with. And he goes, and a way to do that would be to sink the Lusitania. What was so special about the Lusitania? Well, it was a big liner, yes. It was the pride of the British commercial fleet. I mean, the Lusitania and its sister ships were the sort of biggest liners afloat. They were something that were seen as a symbol of British power, especially British maritime power. The other thing the British were doing, which the Germans were well aware of, and the Americans kind of aware of, is that, all those munitions and stuff that were being produced in the United States? Well, they were stuffing the holds of the Lusitania, a passenger ship, but also a ship that carried cargo, with unassembled artillery shells, gun cotton, rifle breech, everything you could, they were full of it. So it was carrying war supplies.
And mixing bullets with babies.
Mixing bullets with babies. And the interesting thing is that under international law, that made it a legitimate military target. And so the Germans actually did have the legal cause to sink it, because it was carrying war contraband. Of course, it was also carrying more than 1,000 passengers. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons. And they had other plans to sink it. Their main plan was that they wanted to place a bomb aboard and they wanted to sink it in port. That was what the original German idea was, not to do it with a U-boat, but to put a bomb aboard. They actually had people working aboard the ship, and they were either going to sink it in New York Harbor or they were going to sink it in Liverpool. But that way, they argued, it would put the ship out of business. Everybody would see it. They couldn't claim it just, sank and disappeared, and nobody would get hurt. It would be unlikely to harm a large number of people. So instead, it ended up being torpedoed off the Irish coast. One of the things that probably speeded the sinking of the Lusitania, this is a controversy to today, is that some of those munitions it was carrying blew up. There was a large, what really sent the ship to the bottom as fast as it did was a secondary explosion.
Yeah, for a while they tried to say that the U-boat had sunk, had fired a second torpedo, but now it was an explosion.
The torpedo and then the secondary explosion. And I think odds are that had something to do with the stuff that was in the holes, and it wasn't cheese. That was one of the things, if you actually look at the manifest, apparently the Lusitania was full of cheese.
Also, ein Schiff voll beladen mit Käse explodierte mehrfach und ging schneller unter als gedacht. Aleister Crowley war auf der Hinfahrt an Halloween. Er feierte auf dem Schiff eine Schwarzmesse, weil er wusste, auf dem Rückweg geht sie unter.
But as someone was able to figure out that cheese wasn't really cheese. It was, the manifests were falsified. So this was one of those things that Crowley was argued that he was influential in. And was he later exaggerating his role? Well, I don't know. Most people probably exaggerate their role if they have one. But I think from his standpoint, I think he was telling something that he thought was true. I think he had seen that his role. So basically, to the German propagandists in the U.S., this is what you need to do. They then communicated that back to Berlin, and the upshot out of it is that the decision was made, maybe not just for that reason, but as part of that reason, that Lusitania was torpedoed and sank, and everything else followed from then. And it did not turn out to be something that would scare the Yankees into not entering the war. In fact, it largely assured that they would. So
and the other side of that, is the British seem to be maneuvering the Lusitania too into its ultimate doom, because
there have been at least a couple of the classic book written about that, which has been which some people believe is a work of genius and others believe is a crock of lies. Is a book by Colin Simpson on the Lusitania. And in that, Simpson, lays out pretty much the case that the Lusitania was being deliberately set up, that its escort was withdrawn, that it was basically being redirected through an area where you knew there were U-boats. And so the interesting thing about being
Also, die Lusitania was set up. Sie war vorbereitet, man nahm die Schutzschiffe drumherum weg und schickte sie genau dorthin, wo man wusste, dass U-Boote sind. Es war wie ein Stück Fleisch für die Wölfe.
Hacked by a submarine in 1915 is that there was basically no such thing as radio communication. So when U-boats went out in that period, unlike World War II, where they operated in wolf packs, they're basically on their own. They're like these lone hunters. So what they would do is they would just sort of operate. They would bob around known shipping lanes, and then you do what a hunter does. You wait for your prey to show up and ambush them. So to be sunk by the U-20 at that particular spot on that particular day just requires, it's one of those things that I don't see how you could plan it, because you would have to plan it from both ends. I do think that there's something that the British Admiralty was certainly willing to take risks. And you could even argue that, and I certainly don't put it past them, if you keep the guy that Admiral Reginald Hall was the guy who ran Admiralty Intelligence, was probably Crowley's ultimate superior in that sense. Hall was the guy who would do anything to achieve his goal. And if that anything included setting up a British liner to be sunk and then exploiting the propaganda value, he would do it. Remember, this is a war. And in a war, any British commander on the Western Front could order attack that would certainly send thousands of men to their deaths.
Yeah, a year later was the Somme.
Yeah. So, where you got 20,000 killed in half an hour and 60,000 in one day. So what's 1,000 or so civilians for the greater cause in this case? And, an interesting...
Genau, das ist der entscheidende Punkt. Wenn man 60.000 Alliierte pro Tag in ein deutsches Maschinengewehr laufen lässt, sind 1.000 Leute auf der Lusitania ein Scheißdreck.
Question might be if there was, and this is the if the Admiralty itself was trying to set up the Lusitania, remember, this again would sort of work, it makes even more sense if Crowley is an Admiralty asset, in that he's also functioned because he's encouraging the Germans to do exactly what it is the Admiral wants them to do. And it's actually quite insidious. But the thing about this is that once you sort of put the pieces together, you see how that insidiousness works.
Well, they call it Perfidious Albion for a reason.
Perfidious Albion for a reason. They didn't get that empire by being nice. Okay.
Fit of absence, right?
No, it wasn't just one of those things that suddenly fell in.
Also, es gab noch nie ein Imperium, was groß geworden ist durch Nettsein. Es war immer Massenmord im Imperium.
their lap or as a result of all of their kind treatment for things. There was a lot of lying and cheating and, you know, looting, raping, and pillaging that went on in order to achieve that. But that's the way empires are born, and that's the way empires are sustained. I guess the other question that comes up in this is that, well, you know, why would Crowley, who seems to be, shall we say, a nonconformist, okay, not someone, I mean, he publicly rejected all forms of sexual propriety and morality. Why would someone like that have the slightest degree of patriotism? I mean, that's not something you would expect from Crowley. And yet it's one of those things that as I began to do the research, and I've seen more of since, is that Crowley was, in his own particular way, a patriotic Englishman. I mean, that's what, there's this statement he gives, again, it's in the book here, and I'm going to have to paraphrase it, but at one point he sort of asked an explanation, you know, essentially, why would a man like you be interested in serving his country? And he gives a reply that is roughly, he says, I don't believe for a minute that the English kettle is any less black than the German pot. All right. I don't believe that England is somehow morally superior to Germany. But he says that my loyalty is the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. That's a Dickens reference there. It's an Oliver Twist. And my master may beat me and starve me, but in the end, I am his dog and I love him. And that's basically is one of those things where it may just be me, but in that particular point, I think that Aleister Crowley was being completely honest in his feelings. I think he was trying to explain the kind of this kind of internal contradiction, or maybe it wasn't a contradiction, as well as he could. You know, he might despise what he thought was the phony morality of Edwardian Britain. He might think that it was corrupt in any number of ways, but you know, the thing was, he was an Englishman. He wasn't a German, and he wasn't a Frenchman, and he wasn't an American. He was an Englishman, and that's where this kind of visceral loyalty lay. You know, the loyalty of Bill Sykes' dog. My master beats me and starves me, but I'm still his dog and I love him. And I think in that way he was just trying to explain, and it's something that comes out, you know, I think he told someone that, you know, his sort of unfulfilled desire was to be an English squire. And so in a way, I think I may have put in the book, certainly I've said it before, that the feeling I came away with was that Aleister Crowley was a kind of cultural rebel in which there was an English conservative screaming to get out. All right, that there were always these kind of, and see, it comes back to this question: is what's the real guy? I mean, when it really would come down to the clinch, you know, when it was an issue, what were those loyalties? And I think that was an example that at the bottom of it, that Crowley had this loyalty to England, and that was kind of a visceral, unreasoning, emotional attachment. I think another way that if he didn't put it, somebody else did. It's this kind of it was the thing that came up. And the question was as to why people joined the Communist Party in the 20s and 30s. And by extension, other sort of radical political movements, even the Nazis in this case. And the explanation that one person came up with, that they go, is that, look, you know, I didn't join the Communist Party because I was intellectually convinced of the validity of its arguments. I joined the Communist Party and I spent years as a loyal communist because I fell in love with it. And see, once that happens, when someone falls in love with an idea, or they fall in love with some image of a country, you know, the thing about love is that reason, logic goes out the window, all right? You know, you can see that in all the people that your friends fall in love with. You know, you realize it probably wasn't such a good idea, but that nevertheless, you're never going to convince them of that otherwise. So yeah, I think that Crowley was, you know, a kind of visceral patriot, and that's what drew him to this. And I think along with just the kind of desire for adventure and for deceit, it gave him a chance to use all kinds of skills like hypnotism. So
yeah,
remember I said earlier that go ahead. Yeah,
the empires sort of gave him a purpose. Then the various the opportunities to exercise his black magic, and also the cynicism in his remarks. Sort of, well, that sort of is an expression of the whole British imperial enterprise, is sort of the British cosmology, where there really is no morality universe. It's all it's empiricism and it's practicalism, where these practical pursuits of power is therefore you're not going to rest your activities or they're going to be based on some idealism or morality, because that's not a practical way to run the world. You have to be sort of ruthless and cynical, and that what he said there is just exposing sort of an emptiness. And that's kind of the type of something you might hear from a James Bond or something.
Yeah. I mean, the type of thing that, at the end of it, you might figure out that pretty much you've been used, and not necessarily for the most noble of causes, but nevertheless, it's a cause you understand.
Didn't Philby say something like, "I served country, king, and club" or something?
Oh, Philby, Kim Philby was, the famous another very famous British trader who served the Soviets. No, the statement I remember from Philby is that when asked, after he defected to the Soviet Union, he was asked, I think by Philip Knightley, he was a British journalist who went to interview him. And the question you want to ask a Philby is, why? Okay, why did you turn your back on your country, your class, everyone, and do this? And Philby's kind of flippant response, I think I'm getting it right, is that one never looks twice at the offer of enlistment in an elite service. And what it was, see, Philby was a guy who was being groomed, again, at Cambridge, or through school, to be a British spy, and is in British intelligence. He's trained and groomed by the British to be an intelligence, and he's recruited by the Soviets at university, where they had agent spotters who were there to try to figure out who were people who might be susceptible to recruitment, and he was. And in fact, after he was recruited, Philby, for some years, outwardly appeared to be a pro-fascist.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he posed as a pro-fascist.
And then again, and wrote, articles extolling Franco and Spain, extolling Hitler and Germany. And this was all as part of a cover. All the while, he is actually functioning as a Soviet agent. But I think what Philby interpreted in this concept about you never look twice at enlistment in elite force is that the other thing that Philby realized is that he's being, he is a British intelligence officer, and his chief opponent, what he's working against, are the Soviets. We call it the KGB, but then it was the NKVD or the GPU. And one of the things you often find is that people often develop great admiration for their enemies. It's one of those kind of odd things. I mean, you can see this in people who are combat veterans. I mean, some of the few people in the world who can understand what you went through were the guys on the other side.
Yeah.
All right. You are all, that's one of those things that even though you're fighting each other, it's a kind of bond that you share that no one else actually shares. And so you can develop admiration. You can even develop an affection. And in Philby's case, he seems to have come to the conclusion that the British intelligence service were kind of second rate and that the Soviets were very good. And when they offered it to work for them, it was too much of an ego stroke to ignore. Mm-hmm. See, that brings in this other element that always tends to fly around, ego. This idea again of having secrets that no one else has, of being able to deceive people, of being the only person in a room who knows something. It's a heady type of thing. I think in some ways it's its own sort of drug. And that's
Genau, das ist der entscheidende Punkt. Ego. All die Erleuchteten da draußen, sie glauben, sie wären egofrei, feiern sich auf ihrer 7. Dimension mit ihrem Ego, weil sie etwas wissen, was alle anderen nicht wissen. Also sie denken jedenfalls, es zu wissen. Und nur wer alles raushaut und es nicht für sich behält, ist egofrei. Ja, das ist immer wieder so eine geile Sache.
Certainly something I think that played in Crowley's part. And the other thing about it is that even though he clearly screwed up seriously on a couple of occasions. There was something that he did in Italy in 1922, which included, by the way, leaving intelligence documents around in Sicily for the Italians to find. That was a big mistake. That really set him cast into the wilderness for some time. So the type of thing, again, is that Crowley isn't an intelligence officer. He's not a career spy. That's not all he does. It's a kind of part-time job in which he is employed as people higher up see him as useful and see him as reliable. Crowley, in his magical career, and in his esoteric or occult career, is constantly trying to win the favor and approval of these beings he calls the secret chiefs. Now, this is his whole idea that there are beings, there are gods and angels and devils out there. There are these beings that you can access and that you can gain power, and that's what he spends his whole life trying to do, with, as he would admit, little success. And it was a huge frustration for him. And I think it's one of those things that, again, he sort of describes, early on, the secret chiefs, the ascended masters, whatever you want to call them, Iwas, whatever the names of the spirit, they sort of reached out and they reveal a little bit to you. It's a bit like having it revealed to you that there's this other world out there. Okay, yeah, we're here. But then you spend the rest of your life waiting for them to come back and tell you more, and they never do. That he never got the reward or the access to those higher spiritual powers that he wanted. So in some way, access and even occasional reward, those strokes he got from people in power in Britain, in the government, was a substitute for that. I mean, I think it was a way, if nothing else, that he could do something that he felt good about, and that he felt that he was doing something useful. It goes back again to this sort of impression that I was left with about him, which was, he was a guy with a wicked sense of humor in some ways, a man with, not a particularly good friend. Okay, had no business sense whatsoever, none. I haven't run across a single Thelemite who would ever claim that. Whatever those to say about him, everybody agrees that he was lousy with money. And in terms of his personal relationships, well, some people claim that every woman he became connected with went mad. I think he tended to be attracted to women who were probably pretty much on the road to the loony bin to begin with. But I don't think their relationship with him helped them at all. He was abusive, mostly, I think, more psychologically than physically. But he would have been a terrible person to live with. I can't.
Is this why celebrities and rock stars try to emulate him so much? Look to him?
Well, I think that the sort of admiration that came about him in the counterculture '60s is that he was sort of picked up as this symbol of anti-establishment. He seemed to stand for all sorts of things. Why could you connect with him? Free love and drugs. There you go.
He's like,
and by the way,
Wilhelm Reich figure or something. Yeah.
Yes, and Crowley really did love his drugs. He was a pioneer in recreational drugs in many ways. Coke, mescaline.
But my point is, you feel like Timothy Leary supposedly is a counterculture figure, but like Crowley, people who've done research found him, he was an asset, intelligence asset.
He's got
drugs. Yeah. Then he's referring to Crowley as the '60s with this age of Crowley. How he says he would have loved to. He even said that Crowley would have lived to see the '60s. That's what Leary said. But I'm saying the point is we have this sort of a consistency thing where you have these assets, these counterculture figures. A lot of people have done that. A lot of the counterculture, if not created, was manipulated by the intelligence agencies. And largely kind of through, we get a kind of a glimpse of how this might be done, because this is how the intelligence agencies, why they're interested in like the occult, which is the arts and the idea of sleight of hand and manipulation of these things, getting into Hollywood and getting into the entertainment industry and these things, having such a vast influence via mass communication, which really came on board after Crowley's death in the 50s with television, but with radio too. But we now know that with Operation Mockingbird and MK Ultra, we see hints of MK Ultra in Crowley's life, don't we?
Well, you could argue, and I think this is maybe going too far, but that he's a kind of pioneer of that.
Yeah.
I mean, here's one of the things that Crowley would do, and he would take notes on. This is kind of Crowley the scholar. One of the drugs that he was very interested in, and in fact, when he's in the U.S. during World War I, he goes up to the Park Davis lab in Detroit, which manufactured this, because you could just go up to the direct and you could buy an entire bag of mescaline. All right, because Park Davis had figured out how to synthesize the active ingredients essentially in peyote.
Yeah.
They weren't quite sure what they were going to do with it yet. But nevertheless, they had this stuff. So he goes on this road trip, and he goes up and he just sort of buys a bunch of it, and then just and goes on magical retreats, and has sex in the redwoods on mescaline, which all sounds like a lot of fun. But the other thing that he did with it is that he would invite people over for dinner, and he would usually fix them some sort of spicy meal, like a curry. Apparently, he fixed a mean curry. And then he would record how much mescaline he put in the curry, or in some cases, how much he put into each person's portion. He wouldn't take any himself on those occasions, and he would then sit back and watch and record the actions and reactions of his guests. He was using them as guinea pigs to test dosages and effects of a psychoactive drug. Now, here's the interesting question. What were those notes for? Was he just doing this for his own amusement, or was it because he could already see possibly that there was potential in this? The thing that MK Ultra, the CIA through MK Ultra were really the pioneers with LSD. Mm-hmm. And what they saw in LSD was what they saw in other potential drugs. And then it comes back to this whole thing that's pretty familiar with us today, enhanced interrogation techniques. Mm-hmm. Is there a way, are these chemicals that can allow us to sort of control, manipulate the architecture of the human mind? That's what they want to do. It's not even really so much, interrogation is just a means, is just a way of getting into the real question of what, for better or for worse, we like to call mind control. So can you take someone and can you control this person? And can that drug assist you in doing it? One of the other things that Crowley sort of combined his interest in drugs with was a very avid interest and a great deal of skill in hypnotism. And in fact, when I was working on the book, I was actually talking about it. I was having a conversation similar to this. I was sort of going through the whole Aleister Crowley thing of explaining why I was interested. And I was talking to a guy who was one of those retired intelligence people that I mentioned previously. Mm-hmm. And no, I'm not going to mention his name. But he had spent something like 25, 30 years in service and, had been in operations. And so, those are the things that he wouldn't talk about. But I'm describing Crowley to him, and he goes, he goes, hypnotism. This guy's just a hypnotist. Everything he does is related to hypnotism. And I said, I asked for more of an explanation. He goes, well, look, it's the whole thing in occultism. What's the whole point of rituals and chants and the rest of this? That's all either auto-hypnosis or it's group hypnosis. What goes on in these things is that Crowley simply developed different means to hypnotize people. And rituals are a way of doing that. The drugs were another way of doing it. But that's what all of his stuff is. And, again, I think that's maybe oversimplifying it a bit, but on the other hand, when he said that, there was a click. And I think that is one of those things that Crowley was continually exploiting, and his ability, it comes down to this question, if your powers as a hypnotist are good enough, and let's say that you were sitting at a meeting of the German propaganda cabinet in New York, and you were able to gain the other people's attention, to what degree are you influencing them by arguments, and to what degree, without their knowledge, are you hypnotizing them? Okay, it's not impossible. So, that's another one of those skills that not everybody has, and it's one of those skills that British intelligence would think, well, maybe there's some case we should send in Crowley. He has unusual powers of influence over certain people.
It's the same way the intelligence agencies would use, in the past, magicians, but also even actors and actresses and even journalists and these things. They can go to places, and they can gain influence and push a certain meme or get information and then, serve their function. It's I mean, that's, I mean, you get a more direct example of Mockingbird, where, you know, the CIA has these journalists that are on the payroll that are, you know, pushing stories or that are favorable to the agency, or to, presumably the United States, the West, whatever. But you still have an example again where not exactly agents, but assets, people who are, because you got to think in concentric circles. The agencies represent certain interests. And those interests are usually corporate, financial.
Gut, moin Andreas. Wir schalten jetzt mal auf kognitive Kriegsführung, den kenne ich nämlich noch nie. Wir haben ja jetzt schon mal eine Sendung drüber gemacht, aber ich bin mal gespannt, was der Jay noch sagt.
And it's describing, I don't know if you are familiar with the Michael Aquino document, Mind War to Psy War, which I think was early 90s or somewhere in there. And I read that many years ago. And this reminds me of that. And then it's kind of like the next phase of that, because that document was kind of setting the Army's doctrine of psychological warfare in moving it forward out of just psyops and into mind war, in the sense of not just changing people's attitudes and perceptions and this kind of stuff, but actually using electronic warfare and the latest means that were available, ELF and VLF stuff, to target the actual human biology. He even gets into things like ELF, VLF waves. He gets into atmospheric engineering and spraying, bioengineering, geoengineering. All of that is included in that old document. And this is like part 2 of that. It's like the next level above that, where now they're kind of bringing to the fore a lot of the tech elements and how technology be involved in psychological warfare in a way that we've never seen before. So there's a lot going on in it. There's a lot of different topics, but in terms of the overview, it's
Und hier hat er schon erzählt. Technik wurde noch nie so eingesetzt wie aktuell unter Corona. Du glaubst, Corona ist real? Kognitive Kriegsführung. MK-Ultra-Algorithmen. Hat man schon mal eine geile Sendung drüber gemacht.
Like the famous, I think it was another Army War College document, Mind Has No Firewall is a good one in this category. Mind War to Psy War, Aquino, and let's not forget Michael Aquino was the founder of the Temple of Set, so he was a famous, well-known, hardcore Satanist. He had at one point been a member of the kind of Anton LaVey outer Puerto Rico kind of goofy satanic groups, and split off to found his own group that was a lot more serious. And what do you know? He happens to be involved in high-level UFO. Let's see, I'm trying to remember all, but he was involved in studying MK Ultra for the Army. He was involved in UFO research, and then he was involved in SpaceCom. So again, this is a person who's not, he might look clownish. I think he recently passed away, but this is a person who was very serious. And this document here, as I said, falls in line with that, as well as Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars. These are all very similar kinds of documents, but yeah, it just basically lays out a new platform for psychological warfare, and the platform is you. There's statements that are similar to one of the documents I haven't gotten to yet, which is the recent UK Ministry of Defense document done in consultation with the German government, called Human Augmentation, the Dawn of a New Paradigm. And the first chapter of that document talks about how human beings are going to be viewed as basically walking biological platforms, meaning like Facebook is a platform or YouTube is a platform. You're now a human platform. And the more that I go, the more I'm starting to think that, with the hobbies, all this, they really view it like we are intended to be basically just walking routers, and they just want humans to kind of be emitters and receivers of that. On all levels. So basically, whatever the latest, PC position is, that's just downloaded into you via the web.
Also, vielleicht habe ich das ja schon mal erwähnt. dass die Impfung der Anschluss ist. Ja, ich mache es extra nochmal auf. Facebook über Corona, über den Great Reset in das Meta-Universe, über die Cloud zur Pfizer mit Patenten 666 ist der Anschluss an das ganze Social Credit System über die Earth Charter zur Grete, über die God AI zum Skynet, zum Robocop, zu Saurons Auge, zu Siri und Alexa, über das Camera Crisis Solution System, über die Man-Maschine-Symbiose und den Deep Dream. Ja, das ist ja all das, was gerade passiert. Und Dyer hat das nochmal bestens erklärt. Moment, so, und play.
Humans, not just as batteries, not just as cattle, but emitters and receivers of the system's message. And then you become a feedback loop. Whatever they put out into the net, then is fed into you, and then you feed it back into the system. Kind of like the feedback loop that's mentioned in Aaron and Melissa's Minds of Men documentary. So that's what we're talking about here. That's what the document's talking about. It talks about this document of cognitive warfare being a part of full spectrum dominance. I'm sure probably many people in your audience have read William Engdahl's book, Full Spectrum Dominance. It's a Pentagon term that they coined, I think, from Rumsfeld a few decades ago. The idea is total control. And so the new domain that's been forged in this document is to hack the human being at all levels. So not just his mind in terms of thought processes, but the actual brain chemistry, because as we'll see, the document goes on into.
Und das ist der entscheidende Punkt. Die Brain Chemistry, die Biochemie in deinem Kopf soll gehackt werden. Erinnert euch an Black Widow-Film. Früher war MK Ultra anders. Jetzt verändern sie deine Biochemie. Und du weißt nicht mehr, welche Gedanken von dir sind und welche dir gedownloadet wurden. Black Widow, kognitive Kriegsführung und die Impfung, die deine Biochemie verändert, damit du der perfekte Sklave wirst.
Implanting nanotech, basically chipping the population. So how to hack the individual is the key point here. And then it goes into examples of cognitive warfare. It talks about making everyone a weapon, and then also everyone potentially being a weapon. The battlefield of the 21st century is the human brain. Humans are the contested domain, and the future conflicts will likely occur amongst people digitally first and then physically thereafter in proximity to the hubs of political and economic power. So they want to be able to put whatever they want into the grid. You accept it and you just basically repeat it. And then more or less what happens is that anyone that doesn't do this is literally, I'm not joking, considered an enemy combatant. So they say that you might not, you don't even know it, but you've probably been infected by the enemy's propaganda. and the document says, we might say China, we might say Russia, but basically anybody, right? So if you just.
Und sagt hier nochmal, der Feind ist nicht China, auch nicht Russland, Iran oder Korea. Der Feind ist jeder, der gegen die NWO ist. Du bist gegen Corona auf der Straße? Dann bist du Feind. Kognitive Kriegsführung wird gegen dich gemacht, aber sei dir dessen bewusst, du bist schlauer als die NATO. Warum? Weil du gute Lehrer hast. Ne? Andreas, Casey und ich haben das Thema schon mal bearbeitet. Ich habe ja so viele Vorträge über Creative Reality und das AI Manhattan Project 2.0 gehalten. Es glaubt nur niemand. Während sie in Corona-Matrix gefangen sind, glauben sie es nicht, dass diese kognitive Kriegsführung gegen sie, ihr wundert euch, warum die so schwer erwachen. Ihr glaubt, die Menschheit ist strunzdumm. Kognitive Kriegsführung, das sind Opfer.
By enemy propaganda. It's very Orwellian. It reminds me of the way, I know this is kind of cliche, but the way that Winston and O'Brien interact. You know, the way that if you doubt Big Brother, it's because you've been listening to some foreign asset or foreign agent, and of course that's all baloney anyway. So I mean, I can keep going, but if you want to interject here, that it's basically just saying, first important point is that it says that cognitive warfare does have the intention to intentionally harm society, and not military enemies.
Yeah, so they intentionally harm society.
Right.
And society is supposedly, at least the civilian world, supposed to control the military.
Mm-hmm.
So who's in control here? I mean,
Genau. Who's in control here?
And also, if you have the ability to control the human mind and manipulate public perceptions of things, you have no effective oversight or democratic control over these institutions, which have gone completely opaque, if not black, in the name of national security. And there's no effective restraint or control. Then
Und da sind wir beim nächsten Punkt, der auch auf der Karte drauf ist. Ja. All das begann mit den hier. Wegen denen haben wir das. Das plus das führt zu all dem. Die Impfung, Bio und Tech ist nur der Anschluss an das Cloud, Golem, Metaverse, Earth Charter, Skynet, LifeLock, Mensch-Maschine-Symbiose-System. Es ist, ich denke mir sowas nie aus, sondern ich habe da gute Gründe dafür. Leider klappt es keiner.
Then you ponder, well, there's no oversight or control. Then you have people of I guess, the character of the Satanist Michael Aquino, devising psychological warfare strategy. It's not, it's not what most people think when they think of the military or their government, at least Americans. They think that, how do you have elections and, supposedly constitutions that the government follows? Of course, we know they don't. But I'm saying, you read a document, or you become aware of a document like this, and you're like, well, wait a second, this isn't what NATO was designed to do originally. Well, maybe it was, but I'm saying as far as it was retailed to the public, this temporary alliance to deal with a specific threat. Now it's, it's like the whole world, So it is.
So one thing I'd noticed a while back, and I'd mentioned, for example, when I did the analysis of the Annie Jacobson History of Darpa book, was that she makes the point that really Vietnam was kind of a test bed for rolling out a lot of the technologies that would be turned on the domestic population in the technocracy. And that's another thing that was mentioned in the Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars document, is that very early on in the document, it says that we learned during the period of wartime, both World War I, II, and Cold War, all of these different strategies that worked in terms of the admin. I think it even mentions the admin. It says that those OSS and admin techniques were then turned on the domestic population.
Also, alle Kriegsstrategien, alle Täuschung, alle Tricks, alles, was man seit dem Ersten Weltkrieg bis jetzt gemacht hat, war Test. Nur um euch jetzt damit was glaubt ihr, von mich alle Militärtaktiken kenne? Jedenfalls die wichtigen. Was glaubt ihr, von mich alle Geheimdiensttricks kenne? Weil all das eine Waffe ist gegen euch. Was glaubt ihr, von mich immer richtig liege, während alle anderen keinen Plan haben? Es ist ganz einfach, weil ich kenne die Tricks der Gangster. Es ist simpel und einfach, wenn du weißt, wie sie agieren. Du bist jetzt der Feind. Du hast es gewagt, Klaus Schwab zu widersprechen.
The Silent Weapons documents declares that this war was declared on the public in 1954 from these Harvard elites and these different Bilderberg type people. So you basically get the implementation of that type of a thing in the NATO document. So basically, just another one of these kind of bookmarks in a long. It's almost like all of these white papers are chapters in a long book of how to just take over the world, basically. So this chapter.
Und das ist gut erzählt. Alle White Papers sind quasi einzelne Kapitel eines langen Buches to take over the world. Ja, es ist faszinierend. It's a made in Germany production. All you know what's evil came from Germany. Wir Deutschen sind mal wieder mittendrin. Mal wieder. Nicht erst seit PCR-Test. Ja, also 2008 der Börsencrash war schon deutsch.
Be later on in the book when we're getting towards third act and they're kind of it's all coming out of the closet publicly, in your face. It's hard to deny. I just got Klaus's new book, by the way, his stakeholder capitalism book. So I'm looking forward to reading that. I'm sure it's going to be full of juicy nuggets, but I can already kind of guess what it's going to say and what it's going to be, given having read his other stuff. So
Klaus Schwab is a good individual to focus on, because look at him, he's sort of an embodiment of this a representation of this power structure, because
he's one of the kind of public sort of figureheads of it.
But he holds no official government position. And this is the governance issue.
But he's a former steering committee of Bilderberg. So that's above government.
Yes,
supra government.
Well, he's the Davos man, and we just recently had this environmental summit, and of course every year we have the World Economic Forum, and people have kind of become a nerd to it. Just maybe it's not reported that this private gathering, or these environmental summits, where politicians meet with business leaders to decide the future for humanity, or how the new economy is going to be designed. And there's no public input or debate in the various parliaments, legislatures of the world. It's almost like it's accepted as we're just going to accept this. And this is, I was reading about this NATO document, how it talks about how the cooperation between governmental bodies and corporations. So it's a public-private partnership. Great.
Right. So Mussolini, but not Mussolini.
Yeah.
If you just say that it's liberal, right, then it's not. Then it's good. It's like socialism, which is okay. But
yes,
if you say fascism, no, it's not fascism, because we're pro-gay. We have a rainbow flag. So you see, it's not. But they're just different operating systems, which work the best. And I think one of these documents, which I've been reading some of these white papers, I get confused. One of them even just talks about the fact that it's not about right and wrong; it's about winning. And so, really, I went back to the Miles Copeland Game of Nations book, because I was looking at when he was talking about the CIA Game Center, and that the Game Center was the basis for Report from Iron Mountain, which was supposed to be satire, but was actually based on a real thing, and that had sort of come out of different corporate meetings that were they really wanted this Cold War to happen. I think ultimately to kind of put the infrastructure in place to have the more or less what would be the technocracy set up. So anyway, we're late in the game, is what I'm trying to say here, when we go through these different chapters and these different white papers. But the document goes on to talk about things that are very Orwellian, like I said, like complete control of the mind. The final domain is the inner domain of the human mind, and not just the external biosphere or anything like that. The all-encompassing militarization of society is reflected in the tone of NATO. The Gray Zone author writes in his summary of the book, or of the document, he says that they might roll out the typical things like, there's Russian sleeper agents, and Russian agents are taking over. And we've already heard this, by the way, with the whole Trump election. That was all foisted upon everybody as a Russian, intelligence operation. All of that fell apart many times over. And even more recently, yet again, has fallen apart. And yet, the whole 4 years of this, right? And that all fell apart. They've admitted the Steele dossier is all fake, but people still believe, because it did its job, basically, right? It was all about perception. It had nothing to do with what was true or false.
No, yeah.
And that's the same way with this document, because it goes on to point out, the Gray Zone author, what was his name? But he points out that the NATO PSYOPs document was utilized, the principles in it were utilized by the Canadian government to push the whole fear PSYOP lockdown. And the mainstream media had reported this about a month ago that the Canadian government used PSYOPs basically to get all of Canada on board with the COVID nonsense. Mm-hmm. And this is the document they were using. This is what they were doing. So in other words, it was this document strategies that utilized neoliberal ideology within NATO to.
Und hier haben wir es nochmal gehört. Das kanadische Volk wurde mit psychologischer Kriegsführung in Corona-Lockdown gebracht. Wie sieht das jetzt auf deutschem Boden aus? Ist Deutschland ein NATO-Mitglied? Würde ein NATO-Staat die NATO-Taktik gegen ein Volk einsetzen, was nicht mit der NATO-Linie konform ist? Natürlich. Natürlich. Der einzige Grund, warum ich und mein Team durchsehen, ist, weil wir die Tricks der Gangster kennen. Alles ist psychologische Kriegsführung. Wenn du auch noch alles anzweifelst da draußen und glaubst, dass nichts real ist, alles ist Photoshop, aber du auch noch faul bist und nie was überprüfst, alles anzweifeln, nur das glauben, was in deinem Kopf ist, aber du bewegst dich nicht. Du kriegst 100% Matrix in deinen Kopf und zweifelst alles andere an, was außerhalb deinem Kopf ist. Du denkst, du bist in einem eigenen parallelen Universum. Und alles ist nicht real. Ja, kognitive Kriegsführung. Wenn ich dir ins Gesicht pupse, merkst du es.
You know, donuts, and all these kinds of things. If you get the stabbies, and if you do what you're told, and if you go along with the lockdowns, I mean, all of that was out of this document's strategy.
It was like lottery tickets in West Virginia, hamburgers in New York. I guess was it Illinois? Six Flags tickets or something.
Well, that's what I was going to say is like, okay, so that means it wasn't just the Canadian government that was using this model. It was Uncle Sam too. Yeah, various incentives, and then was it De Blasio, the soon-to-be ex-mayor of New York, said, "Well, we tried to do it voluntarily. Now we're gonna have to force people." It's like, what is it about volunteer? Don't you understand? I mean, it's like, obviously, it was never intended to be voluntary. Right. Ottawa's. The author notes that Ottawa's press release stated, cognitive warfare positions the mind as a battle space and contested domain. Its objective is to sow dissonance, instigate conflicting narratives, polarize the opinions, and radicalize various groups. This is cognitive warfare. It can motivate people to act in ways that can disrupt or fragment a cohesive society. So they are literally saying, we wanted to sow dissension, chaos.
Also, kognitive Kriegsführung ist Radikalisierung. Man will doch die Corona-Gegner auf der Straße, die jetzt radikal zur Waffe greifen. Man will doch Leute vor den Häusern der Politiker. Man will doch Bundeswehrsoldaten. Lustig, ist die Bundeswehr in der NATO? Ach Mensch, du. Ha. Man will doch Bundeswehrsoldaten, die jetzt zum Bürgerkrieg aufrufen und zum Putsch. All das hilft dann wieder der Politik, Dinge zu verbieten. Ein Attila Hildmann erfüllt 100% kognitive Kriegsführung mit allem, was er macht. Ohne ihn könnte die SPD niemals den Sachsen irgendwas verbieten. Attila macht was, SPD macht was dagegen und die Sachsen leiden. Das ist ganz einfach. Wie oft muss Attila Hildmann über Holocaust und alles andere reden, bis wir Sachsen ein Gesetz kriegen, was uns Sachsen alles verbietet? Wie lange, lieber Attila? Du Kleiner, du bist der Erste auf der Liste ganz oben. Ich sag's dir nochmal, damit es gleich weißt. Wir Sachsen warten nur auf dich. Attila. Der Flüchtling. Ja, Flüchtling. Aber es ist exakt das, was ich sagte. Wie oft muss man über Holocaust reden, bis Telegram zensiert wird? Warum macht er das denn nicht auf Facebook? Oder irgendwo anders? Nein, er macht es auf Telegram. Damit wir Sachsen Probleme kriegen. Ob er das jetzt weiß oder nicht, ist mir scheißegal. Es ist mir scheißegal. Das muss er dem Richter erklären. Nur ich habe dich von Anfang an gefressen und alle anderen Stressmaker. Alle 23 Leute, die beim Sturm auf den Reichstag mit vor Ort waren, sind Party-Stressmaker. Alle Videos von Cops, die irgendeinen umklatschen. Was glaubt ihr, wo ihr die Videos andauernd seht? Ihr sollt Cops umklatschen. Damit die Cops dann mit der Regierung bessere Gesetze machen können, die uns Sachsen wieder das Wort verbieten. Weil wir nicht mit Gewalt können. Weil wir es anders machen. Und das muss verhindert werden. Attila.
That plays into the lockdowns. I mean, they're just literally saying, yeah, we psyoped everybody into lockdown.
Yeah, and then they can gain the reaction to it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Genau. Dann wird so oft die Reaktion. Was dann bei uns Sachsen wieder zu einer Reaktion führt. Dann machst du noch einen mit Verfassungsschutz, möchte gerne Anschlag und ein paar Hakenkreuze hier und da von der Antifa und schon hast du wieder eine Reaktion. Und dann gibt es wieder mehr Geld für noch mehr Reaktionen.
And then just obviously there's going to be a reaction and opposition to it.
Well, and this is another point that vindicates everybody's analysis about the masks, because the document, or it says cognitive warfare seeks, this is the definition, cognitive warfare seeks to change the way not only that people think, but how they act.
Genau, das ist es. Nicht nur, wie sie denken, wird verändern, sondern auch, wie sie reagieren, wie sie sich bewegen, wie sie denken, wie sie fühlen, wie sie... Deswegen gibt es auch Nürnberg-Prozesse. Ja.
Wrote in its official statement, attacks against the cognitive domain involve integration of cyber disinfo, misinfo, and psychological and social engineering capabilities.
Also Missinfo, Disinfo und psychologische Kriegsführung. Gut, dass ich Vorträge über diese Themen halte. Ja?
The PSYOP was entrainment, getting you to, the mask was getting you to go along. That's it. To the whole thing. Because if you're wearing the mask, then you're de facto believing the rest of the narrative, and you're going to get the stabbies.
Yeah, and they pretty much admitted that. I mean, even the public spokesperson, people, the Surgeon General, Fauci, they went back and forth on it.
Und das ist wieder die psychologische, kognitive Kriegsführung. Jeder sieht den anderen da draußen mit der Maske und denkt sich, oh Gott, ist der dumm, oh Gott, ist der dumm. Und der mit der Maske sagt sich, ich muss sie tragen, aber nur bis ich zu Hause bin. Denn ich weiß selber, dass es Schwachsinn ist. Ganz Deutschland ist schon wach. Hallo, wir sind eines der schlauesten Länder auf diesem Planeten. Nur jeder da draußen glaubt, dass er mit seiner Meinung alleine dasteht. Deswegen sagt er nichts. Wissen tun es alle. Wissen tun es alle. Aber sie denken alle aufgrund der psychologischen Kriegsführung und der Social-Media-Kriegsführung kundenspezifisch auf sie zugeschnitten. Auf ihre Freundesfreunde und. Innerhalb ihrer eigenen Filterbubble. Dort denken sie, sie stehen mit ihrer Meinung alleine. Und dort kann man sie radikalisieren, gezielt angreifen und damit noch Gesetze zu machen, um alle anderen, die vielleicht dran denken, aufzuwachen, auch wieder einzuschüchtern. Das ist ein perfektes System aus Lügen, Lügen, Lügen und Betrügen. Mit Angst in Kombination. Klappt nur nie bei mir.
It's like, if it helps other people feel good, go along. Just do it for other people to go along. It was something like that. He said something like that.
Then he admitted saying that he didn't want people to use too many of them, so he lied about their efficacy, one way or the other. Say, well, then why should we trust you? If you're being political with science, then obviously you can't trust the science, because obviously this is a PR game. It's not science. At the very least, you're admitting that you're not being forthright or honest, and then you supposedly have these scientists and technocrats who are all objective and logical. They're not. They're just shills.
Exactly. They're like high-level salesmen, basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's just why you have the whole.
Genau. Lauterbach ist ein Verkäufer. Er verkauft das Produkt nur schlecht. Aber er ist nichts anderes als ein Verkäufer. Merkel ist auch eine Verkäuferin.
PSYOP, you have who's the who's the spokesperson for the response or the expert that CNN's interviewing every day? It's Bill Gates, who's a college dropout. You know.
Yeah, a guy who does virus stuff. I've always thought that was.
Yeah, and then the shots themselves, they resemble like an update, right? Like a periodic update you need on your operating system because of viruses.
Well, I mean, wasn't this John C. Lilly's point? Was that?
Ha, der war böse. Die Impfung aller 6 Monate ist das Update für das Antivirenprogramm auf deinem Körper innerhalb deiner. Also wenn die dich jetzt schon zur Maschine gemacht haben, brauchst du auch ein Update regelmäßig. Das ist so böse. Das ist so böse eigentlich. Oh, krass. Aber nicht auszuschließen. Absolut nicht auszuschließen. Eher viel zu real. Alle 6 Monate eine Impfung heißt alle 6 Monate ein Update für die Software oder für die Android, die sie auf dir platziert haben. Du bist jetzt ein Router. Du bist jetzt ein Android-Handy. Über 5G können sie dir Gedanken rein und raus spielen. Aber das Update gibt es immer noch per Spritze. Oh, das ist so böse. Fragt euch, ob das geht. Technisch umsetzbar ist es. Sind sie kriminell und würden das machen? Ja.
The programming and meta-programming in the human biocomputer. So, yeah, we're walking routers and platforms for these people.
And then you have, of course, was it Borla, the CEO of Pfizer, saying that those who are skeptical about mandatory jabs and the whole,
are all criminals. Yeah. So one thing you notice is that they do a lot of projection, right? So basically, like they know they're criminals, and then they just will say you're a criminal.
Well, yeah, like I said, his company's paid out more than $2 billion in criminal fines the past couple decades. So like, wait.
Wer gegen die Impfung ist ein Krimineller, sagt der Pfizer-Chef. Die sind so geil. Ja, das ist faszinierend.
Yeah, right. No, I don't think most people in the skeptical conspiracy crowd, probably have never come anywhere close to any kind of crimes like that.
Yeah, I've never laced baby powder with asbestos, but Johnson & Johnson has. So.
Was? Johnson & Johnson hat Babypuder mit Asbest versetzt? Alter, Babypuder mit Asbest versetzt? Das hab ich noch nicht gewusst. Das sind die krass.
Yeah, I don't have a criminal record, but you're calling me a criminal when you literally have a criminal record. I mean, it's just not going to work.
But that's again all that's just part of the. I don't know if it's part of humiliation or just psyop or gaslighting you on these things.
Well, I was noticed to remember too. A lot of these people are narcissistic psychopaths, and I don't mean to get too psychobabbly, but the last few days I've been researching kind of famous con men, and if you notice the patterns of well-known cons, you'll see a lot of these kinds of patterns in those people. Like they will typically constantly double down. So one of the weaknesses of those kinds of people is that they can never admit they ever made a mistake at all, even a tiny mistake, because they see themselves right in an irrational way, like they're these superhumans. Think about the Patrick Bateman character in American Psycho. His delusion of who he thinks he is just completely divorced from reality, but that's the operating system in his mind, is that he views himself in that superhuman way, and they see themselves as these fantastical geniuses. They claim to be the inventors and creators of things that are just impossible, and they lie all the time. Like they sort of compulsively lie. So you'll notice in a lot of the big con men the same patterns of how they are with a lot of these people pushing this kind of stuff. They're just sort of like con men at a higher level, basically.
Yeah, and I think the political system, what's that book? Political Ponerology, where the psychology is sort of a psychopathic ruling managerial class. That's what we have, obviously at the federal level. But that and just incompetence, sort of, you have a senile president who's literally just there. I mean, it's like, it's almost like the. Well, no, that's
symbolic. It's an interesting symbol, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think it's gotten to the point where Trump served in many ways. Maybe represented something that they didn't like, but he did serve their interests, whether it's manipulated or intended. But then Biden serves sort of the latter stage American empire and its humiliations phase. Yeah. Same with the vice president. It's like
the decline phase. Yeah.
Well, you have all these octogenarians that are like Nancy Pelosi and Biden. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you really think they're making any decisions? No, of course they're not. I mean,
no, they're just they're on pills all day and half out of it, apparently.
Ja.
Die sind den ganzen Tag auf Pillen. Das glaube ich dann sogar. Das ist der entscheidende Punkt. Die Leute dort haben noch nie Entscheidungen getroffen. Und wenn du jetzt alle Leute drumherum wegnimmst, die eigentlich die Entscheidung getroffen haben, und dann bloß eine Baerbock dastehen hast, ohne plötzlich Baerbock, die ist jetzt, enjoy their show, sag ich da. Das sind bloß noch die Verkäufer da. Und sie verkaufen das Produkt, weil sie wissen nie, was sie sonst machen sollen. Guck dann Lauterbach an. Das ist ein Verkäufer.
Yeah, and you get like the Cuomo character or Gavin Newsom. They never want to admit they're wrong, even though Cuomo, might go to jail now. Sexual harassment, so, but
I remember too, like, I don't remember where I heard this, but some book somewhere, some lecture, but somebody had said, one of the CIA policies.
Das mit dem Bluetooth. Ich gehe fest davon aus, dass es das gibt, aber ich glaube nicht, dass das Video real ist. Weil die machen nicht so einen Fehler. Normalerweise passiert so ein Fehler nicht. Aber ich gehe fest davon aus, dass über jedem von unserem Kopf schon unsere Auschwitz-Nummer steht. Habe ich Auschwitz gesagt? Ihr wisst, was ich meine. Ja? Dieser 20-stellige Zahlencode, der dich überall auf dem Planeten registriert und findet und anhand deiner Stimme, deiner 48 Gesichtspunkte, deiner DNA und allem drum und dran generiert wird. Dieser Code wird schon garantiert über deinem Kopf schweben. Aber normalerweise kommt sowas nie raus. Weil es so krass ist. Und falls es doch rauskommt, dann hat vielleicht jemand das generiert, um den Menschen zu zeigen. Also ich gehe fest davon aus, dass das geht. Aber ich glaube nicht, dass die Fehler machen bei solchen Dingen. Egal, reicht das mal. Ich gucke jetzt noch ein bisschen Black Widow fertig. Auf Discord. Aber für die es interessiert, kognitive Kriegsführung oder das Aleister Crowley Buch. Ich weiß nicht, ob es das auf Deutsch gibt. Egal, bis später.